Hello everyone, welcome back. This week we're talking about chapter 7, and this is all about sampling. So this is adding another layer to your toolbox of understanding how to perform research. So in this chapter we're going to talk about two main things. First is generalizability. That asks the question, does a sample represent the population? Second thing is going to be external validity. What matters the most when we're looking at that in terms of sampling? All right, so things to know about when it comes to generalizability. First is the difference between populations and samples. Second is, when is a sample biased? Third, obtaining a representative sample, how we do that. And then when we have to settle for an unrepresentative sample, what other techniques are used. So first thing, populations and samples. So the population is everybody that fits a category. So for example, one category could be USU students. That would be every single USU student anywhere where they're located if they are a student. A sample is just a subset of that, so it's just some of that population. It's different than a census, where the census tries to get data from everyone. So if we have USU students, a sample could be, we just randomly pick A numbers from a list, and that would be a sample. So when we're thinking about getting a sample, the first thing we have to talk about is, what is our population of interest? Who do we actually care about? And we need to define that very clearly. So in general, this is where students can sometimes have problems, is they don't define their population very well. So you need to be very specific. It still can be a broad population, like I said, USU students, or American citizens, or people living in Utah. All of those things are populations, but I'm being specific about it. Living in Utah, I would need to say they are currently living most of their time in Utah. That could be one way to define it. And I'm sure there's ways that we could further clarify some gray areas there. So when it comes to picking a sample from these populations, consider a few of these examples. So if our population of interest is Democrats in Texas, a bias sampling technique would be recruiting people sitting in the front row at the Texas Democratic Convention. Now be thinking, why would that be biased? Why would that not represent all Democrats in Texas? So one reason could be that people in the front row are the most passionate of all the Democratic individuals in Texas. They are there early, they're there participating. That means they are very, very involved. It's unlikely that all Democrats in Texas are as involved as those people. So an unbiased sampling technique in this situation could be obtaining a list of all registered Texas Democrats from public records and then calling a sample of them. So here are two other examples you can look through. The idea is a biased one is going to be usually easier to obtain, but it's not going to represent the whole population very well. So this example, where we were talking about individuals on the front row, how are they different from possibly other Democrats that might vote? So we talked about some, they're more passionate, they're more involved. They could even be an entirely different age group. Maybe they're older individuals compared to younger individuals that don't participate as much. There can be different backgrounds that make them very different from other Democratic voters. So it might not just be that they're more passionate. There could be loads of reasons why they're actually different from other Democrats in the state of Texas. So ways to get a bias sample. When we want something that's easy, so something where we can easily contact the individuals, that's usually what's called a convenience sampling. There's lots of ways to do this. There's ways online. This is a system called Mechanical Turk where people sign up and you can pay them money to take your survey. The issue with all of these approaches, like convenience sampling, is that there's no guarantee that you're getting a representative sample. The individuals that participate on something like Mechanical Turk are people that have extra time on their hands, possibly work inside, possibly need more money. These are very specific individuals, types of individuals that might not really represent what most people are like. So an example of this is these health indicators here. And the question is, are you a current smoker? So there's different ways of contacting people. This one you can use landline only or landline plus wireless households. So they have at least a landline. And they might also have a wireless phone. It's about 50% of people. If you just use that, there's about 11.5% that say, yeah, I'm a current smoker. But what if you're just using wireless? So they don't have a landline. So all you can do is call their wireless phone. It jumps up to almost 19%. And then people that don't have a phone at all, so you came and called them, you'd have to stop by their house. It's almost 21%. So if you're using people that have a landline, you're getting a very unique type of individual, someone that's less likely to smoke than these individuals. You also can see this in terms of having a heavy drinking day in the past year and then getting your flu shot. These guys are less likely to have a heavy drinking day and are more likely to get a flu shot than these individuals. Another way to get a bias sample is sampling only those who volunteer. So you can set posters up and say, please be part of my study, or you can do it online. I've done several Twitter polls, and those are not generalizable. Very certain people are looking at my Twitter account and are participating in my poll. The same thing happened here when the AAP, so American Academy of Pediatrics, asked people, will you keep your child in a rear-facing car seat? So they gave this information and then they said, do you plan to follow this advice? So people that are like, yeah, I love that advice, they are the people that are more likely to participate in that study for the most part. There's some, if you're really set in your ways and you really want people to know that you will not follow that advice, then you might participate as well. But you're probably going to miss the people that are more in the gray area, that they're considering it but aren't really sure yet. Even though they gave this, I'm not sure, those people, they don't have to respond. And so they're probably just not going to. And so this is going to be a bias sample. This one, on the other hand, was randomly sampled. And so these results are much more likely to be generalizable to the population. So when external validity is really important, you want things to be generalizable. You want your results to be able to say something about the population. Researchers need to obtain a representative sample. Best way to do that is using probability sampling. The simplest version of that is simple random sampling, which basically is just putting every possible population member's name in a pool and then randomly selecting some of those. So in that case, everyone has an equal probability of being selected, which means your sample is likely to be representative of the population. So there's lots of ways of doing a simple random sample in practice, but all of them basically say you have everyone that you could select, and then you just randomly select some of them. There's other ways that you can use probability sampling. There's cluster sampling, multi-stage, stratified, random, oversampling, and systematic sampling. All of these are used and can be used really well. They're useful in very specific cases. The cluster sampling you'll see a lot when you're trying to get a big representative sample of a big population, but it's difficult to go to too many places. So like one study looks at hearing loss in all the states in the United States. But you don't want to have to go to 5,000 different towns in America to get a representative sample. So you can use cluster sampling, so you only have to go to like 40 places instead. And you can still get a representative sample that way. All of these have the same ideas. When you have a limitation that makes it so you can't do your regular sampling, this is the way to do it. These are options so that you don't have to do the simple random sampling. These are all explained in the book, and you should look into them and let me know if you have questions. Overall, they're all workarounds to make the sampling representative while not being too burdensome. The one I do want to mention is oversampling. And this is where there may be really underrepresented groups or underrepresented groups. So individuals that are minorities and have a disability, there's not very many to sample from in any given place. So what you might do is try to get as many of those individuals as possible. It's not perfectly random, but you need to get the information from those individuals if it's a big part of your research question. So you actually can oversample really small groups by just getting more and more of them, so you get more information from them. So when you do settle for an unrepresentative sample, the non-probability sampling techniques, we talked about convenience. There's also purposive sampling. There's snowball sampling, quota. Basically, these use different techniques to get as many people in certain groups as you can, quota especially. Snowball sampling is a cool one. It's a variation on purposive sampling, in which participants are asked to recommend other participants in the study. So purposive is where you ask for certain types of people. So I want smokers that live in Logan, Utah. So I'm only going to be trying to find them. Snowball would add to that and it would say, maybe smokers in Logan know other smokers, so we can ask them who we should go to next. Both of those are not representative. They can be very biased. Quota is similar to the stratified random sampling. We didn't talk about that much. But basically the researcher says we need to have at least this number of these people, this number of these people, and this number of these people. And so you just make sure that you get those numbers of those people. You're not randomly letting those numbers build up. You're just saying that's how many we need, and I'm going to go find those people. So I like this graph. This is one to use to remind yourself of the different types of sampling. So over here, probability sampling, all members of the population have an equal and known chance. Population where you're doing non-probability sampling, some types of people are going to be systematically left out. So you got these 4 for non-probability and these 5 for the probability. So one place that I've seen students get confused is the difference between random sampling and random assignment. There are 2 randoms, and so it's easy to confuse the 2. Random sampling is just where you are getting people into your study and you do it randomly. So doing that increases external validity. Whether your study is an experiment, observational, survey, whatever, random sampling is what you want. Random assignment, on the other hand, is used only in experimental designs to assign participants to groups at random, which increases internal validity. So these 2 can be used together. You can have random sampling to get people into your study, and then you can randomly assign them to groups if you're doing an experiment. So when it comes to external validity, what matters most? So in a frequency claim, so 12% of people are current smokers, external validity is a priority. We want that number to represent the population. So in some cases, when you're using non-probability samples, external validity is a lower priority. Those samples can be used when you're looking at things like relationships between variables. Or sometimes in some samples, an experiment works just fine, even if it's a non-probability sample. One thing that can feel like you're making up for it is by getting a big sample. So if I just get a huge sample, it feels like, well, that has to be more representative, but it's not. For example, if I want to do a study on American individuals or adults, what if I grabbed everyone in Utah? It'd be a huge sample, that's like 2 million people. But does that represent the East Coast? Does it represent the West Coast? Probably not. So just because you get a big sample, it doesn't mean that it's more representative. It does, however, mean that you do have more information, but that information can be biased. So related to this is this idea of margin of error. So in general, when you get a sample and you're making a frequency claim, there's always going to be some error in your estimate. There's going to be some uncertainty in it. So you probably have seen this in different polls out there, possibly by like the Pew Research Center. So if they have a sample size of 2,000, the margin of error is going to be plus or minus 2%. So they might say 12% of people smoke in the US. And then they would say plus or minus 2%. So that is saying 12% is our best guess, but it definitely would be reasonable to think that 10% is just as correct as 14% and 12%. All of those are possible. One thing to note about this, though, the margin of error only is meaningful if the sample is representative. When you're looking at a study, that's one of the things to look at. Is that study, is it randomly sampling? Because if not, then even though they're giving this nice margin of error and everything, it might not be accurate. So that is it for Chapter 7. I hope this was helpful, that you're understanding the difference between samples and populations and what helps the sample be representative versus a biased sample. Please reach out if you have questions.